on China, he's both right and wrong. And I'll explain what I mean by that. China is not behaving like the United States is behaving when it emerges a great power. So it's amazing that China hasn't fought a major war since 1979, we're not seeing the end of the West. The West will still remain a strong and powerful civilization. But at the same time, if you look at an example of the Western reluctance to share power with the rest of the world. And that's why I think it's very important for the rest of the world to try and educate the West on how to manage this transition. And ASEAN was established in 1967, 8th August 1967, as a pro-American organization. So I think if you are a young Asian, this is the best time to be alive in Asia.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you can do is to like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Professor Mahbubani is one of Asia's most prominent public intellectuals, a former diplomat, and a leading voice in global affairs. He served in Singapore's ambassador to United Nations, including 2 terms as president of the United Nations Security Council and later as the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the prestigious National University of Singapore, where he teaches currently. He is best known for his provocative and thoughtful books, including Can Asians Think?, The Great Convergence, and Has the West Lost It?, where he challenges Western assumptions and argues for greater Asian agency in global governance. Professor Mahbubani brings a unique perspective from both the East and the West, having spent decades navigating international diplomacy and engaging with strategic thought. Professor Mahbubani, welcome to India and Global Left.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We've been following your work for a long time, but I think what made us to reach out immediately is this recent debate that we had with Professor John Mearsheimer when we had him on our show regarding this idea called as containment of China. And Professor Mshimer argued that the West and its allies in the East should participate in containing China because it's not just a threat to the West, but it's also destabilizing in the Asian regions. He said that the Asian nations cannot resolve their conflicts within themselves. We took a different position where we said that the presence of the United States raises the smaller differences within these nations to a much larger global conflict. And it was in this video where we got tens of comments requesting us to invite you to comment on this larger debate on containment of China. So if you could respond to this debate, that would be a great start.
Well, I mean, I know John Mearsheimer. He's a friend of mine. I agree in general with his geopolitical realism. And I also agree with him, for example, on how the Ukraine war could have been avoided if the West had been more sensitive to Russia's legitimate security concerns, So I think he's put forward a case for how the Ukraine war could have been avoided. But on China, he's both right and wrong. And I'll explain what I mean by that. He's right in the sense in saying that the United States, he predicted United States behavior accurately. He said that no great power would allow another emerging great power to take its place as number one. And he predicted that United States would work to stop China. And he was proven to be right in that prediction. But at the same time, he also supports the United States efforts to stop the rise of China. And this is where I disagree with him because as you know, I wrote a whole book, Has China Won, on the US-China struggle. And my main thesis there is that it's absolutely futile for United States to stop the rise of China. It will not succeed in doing so. And there are wiser ways and means of managing the rise of China. And one of the wiser ways and means is to work with China to create an international order that is in the interest of the United States, in the interest of China, and hopefully in the interest of all of us too. So there are wiser ways and means of handling China rise. And this is where I disagree with John Mearsheimer. And as you know, I'm not the only one who disagrees with John Mearsheimer. One of his good friends, Jeff Sachs from Columbia University, who also agrees with Mearsheimer's views on Ukraine, disagrees with his views on China.
We also hosted Professor Jeffrey Sachs, so just to plug that in. I guess before we discuss a little bit about your views on the current international orders, if you could tell us a little bit about what are your thoughts about where the West is headed now? I think there's a lot of talk about the decline of the collective West now. It's primarily because of slow growth following the global financial crisis, most dramatically in Europe, but also in the United States. Secondly, I would say the decline of the hegemony of liberal democracy and the rise of the far right that kind of erodes the West's hegemony as a political system that it had. And finally, I would say the rise of the global South, particularly of East Asia, but also countries like Singapore, which has materially leveled up, busting the myth that it is just the West that is infrastructurally and materially developed. And so a lot of people are discussing about decline of the West. I'm very curious what your thoughts are about these debates.
Yeah. You know, I have written, as you know, a lot, including the book Has the West Lost It? And I also gave a TED talk on where the West has gone wrong. I want to emphasize that, you know, when I speak about the end of the era of Western domination of world history, which is what we are seeing, we're not seeing the end of the West. The West will still remain a strong and powerful civilization, very strong, very powerful. It has tremendous amount of resources, and the combined West still has a majority share almost of the global economy. So you cannot write them off. But at the same time, if you look at the trend lines, is the West becoming more powerful in general or less powerful in general? There's no question that the West is becoming less powerful. Its share of the global GNP is shrinking. And just to give you one statistic that would astonish your listeners, you know, I come from Southeast Asia, and our regional organization is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The combined GNP of the ASEAN region is about 3.5 to 4 trillion, whereas the European Union is 5 times bigger at 17.5, 18 trillion. And yet, despite the fact that the European Union is much bigger than ASEAN, ASEAN added more to global economic growth in the decade 2010 to 2020 than the European Union did. This is amazing. Our economy is 1/5 the size. We added more to global economic growth. But it's a sign of how Europe, in a sense, is declining. Now, the American economy is not declining. The American economy still remains very strong and powerful. But as we all know, American society is a deeply troubled place now. Again, in my book, you know, Has China Won, in chapter 7, I describe how the United States has functionally become a plutocracy. And, you know, when you're a plutocracy where all the benefits of development go to the top 1% or top 0.1%, and the bottom 50% have not seen any improvement in the standard of living for several decades now, something has gone wrong with the society. And that explains, by the way, I'm sure we'll discuss it later, why the people of America voted for a populist president like Donald Trump, because they want a president who attacks the elites of America, who they feel have let them down. So clearly, as you can see, the two pillars of the West are the European Union and the United States, and both are struggling in many serious ways with the way forward. So I don't see in any way Western domination of world history returning in any way. Now, of course, the other big problem, which I hope we'll discuss, is that there are ways and means of managing the end of Western domination. The West could do it in wiser ways by learning to share power with other parts of the world. But this is something that the West is unable to do. And this is not a wild claim because, I can tell you, for example, after the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, at the G20 meeting, the Western countries agreed that future heads of IMF and World Bank will be selected on the basis of merit, not on the basis of nationality. And that was incidentally 17 or 18 years ago. And guess what? Nothing has changed. They still insist that the head of the World Bank must be an American, the head of the IMF must be European. This is an example of the Western reluctance to share power with the rest of the world. And that's why I think it's very important for the rest of the world to try and educate the West on how to manage this transition. And I always emphasize I'm not an enemy of the West. I'm not trying to bring down the West. I'm trying to guide the West towards a wiser way of managing its relative decline in the world.
I think it's a good point to hear from you about these international institutions themselves, because as President Trump is in many ways attacking in many of these institutions, WTO with these tariff wars is seriously under question now. Things like dispute resolution mechanisms are now effectively dead. And the IMF has completely lost any legitimacy in the global south. Places like Africa, it has become a debt collecting agency rather than stabilizing or imparting any financial stability, as it says. And then there's the United Nations, which I'm very curious what your thoughts are. But I think my larger question here is that in many ways, this international order was created by the West, and the West has been the beneficiary, and the rest of the global South has fought or struggled to be included within these institutions. But at this moment, these institutions are under attack. And parallelly, we see rise of alternative institutions. I'm talking about BRICS, I'm talking about ASEAN, and SCO, and so on and so forth. Is the decline or is the attack on these existing mainstream international institutions a good thing for the global South, given it has always been the hegemony of the West, or is it a bad thing because it creates too much chaos all of a sudden?
Well, I think, the answer is a somewhat strangely complex one. There's no question that the IMF and World Bank have to try and reinvent themselves in many ways, because they haven't really found a way of giving voice to the views of the majority of the world. That's very clear, because they are still dominated by the West very, very strongly. The United Nations is different. The United Nations General Assembly still, whatever decisions it passes, reflects the views of the global majority. So there is no country, by the way, membership of the United Nations is voluntary and no country leaves. So that's a sign of their willingness to, stay on. Of course, they want to see reforms, but they're not fundamentally troubled by the way the UN is functioning. Although the UN Security Council, as you know, dominates the West. But what the larger issue on the world order is a much more complex one, because what is happening now is something very strange. Much of the institutional framework for our global order, including the rules for our global order, were worked out by the West at the end of World War II. It's called the 1945 Rules-Based Order. But what is strange now is that many of the institutions that have been created as a result of the 1945 Rules-Based Order have now been embraced by the majority of the world and now rejected by elements of the West, especially the United States under the President Trump. And I give you a concrete example. You have the World Health Organization, which frankly plays a very important role in our world today. To understand why the World Health Organization is important, I use a simple boat analogy to explain how the world has changed. In the past, when you had 8 billion people living in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, right? Each boat had a captain and crew, and they were separated. So, for example, if one boat got COVID, the other boats wouldn't get COVID. They can't. COVID cannot fly across the oceans, right? To another boat. But the world has shrunk. And the 8 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. The 8 billion people live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. And that's why when one cabin got COVID, all 193 cabins got COVID. You're on the same boat. Now, if you're on the same boat, it doesn't make sense just to take care of your cabin because, diseases, pandemics, everything can spread effortlessly, through the oxygen circulating, the air circulating in the ship, and so on and so forth. So clearly, we must come together to save ourselves from common threats. And therefore, we should be strengthening the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, as I document in another book of mine, The Great Convergence, the West, and I say the West because the United States has been the one that's trying to weaken the World Health Organization, but the Europeans have been complicit in that. And the proof of that is that, 30, 40 years ago, 75% of the contributions to the World Health Organization were compulsory SS contributions. Now they're down to 18 to 20%. And you can't run an organization if only 20% of your budget comes from compulsory contributions. So this is how the West has been weakening the World Health Organization, and unwisely so. And this is what I find very puzzling, because in the past, you always had good long-range thinkers in the West who would look ahead and who would try and figure out what kind of world is coming and how we adjust to it, and how we adapt to it, and make intelligent, wise decisions. Now you find that there is, frankly, an absence of leadership in both the United States and in Europe to manage global challenges. And that I think is one of the fundamental problems that the world faces today, is the inability of the West to realize that we live, in a sense, in a common boat today on planet Earth, and we have to come together to solve the common global problems instead of walking away from organizations like the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization.
So if I understand you correctly, what you were saying is there are international organizations that we shouldn't completely abandon, and WHO, UNFCCC, parts of WTO, the United Nations, those should be defended, even made more inclusive, and so on. And there are probably organizations like the IMF, NATO for sure. NATO should go. The IMF should be abandoned, probably doesn't provide any financial stability and so on. My next question would be, how do you see the role of the People's Republic of China in this emerging new world order? Does it attempt to provide stability, or does China want to create a completely new order under its own leadership?
Well, one of the single biggest change that has happened to our global order over the last 3-4 decades has been the re-emergence of China. as a great power. That's the single biggest change that's happened in the world. And there's something remarkable about the way that China has emerged that most people are not aware of, including people in the West. Traditionally, when great powers emerge, as they become stronger, they immediately try to flex their military muscles and launch wars and conquer other territories. That's how it's happened. In fact, the man who pointed this out is a Harvard professor whom I know well, Professor Graham Allison. And, in his book called Destined for War, and I cite him in my book as China One, he says that Americans often wish that China could be like America. And he tells his fellow Americans, be careful what you wish for. He says, when we Americans, when we became powerful, sometime in the 1890s is when the United States emerged as the number one power in the world. He said, what do? We immediately declared war on Spain. We conquered Philippines. We conquered Cuba. We seized territories. We had wars. He says that's what all great powers do. And he says, fortunately, China is not behaving like the United States is behaving when it emerges as a great power. So it's amazing that China hasn't fought a major war since 1979, when it had a major war with Vietnam at the Sino-Vietnamese border. That's 46 years. I mean, there have been skirmishes, there have been, accidents at the sea and so on and so forth, but there has been no major war. And that's remarkable for a great power to emerge in the way that China has without fighting a major war. And this is something that we should be welcoming. And therefore, the rest of the world should be working with China to try and accommodate China in this new global order and therefore have a more peaceful outcome. Unfortunately, the people in both United States and Europe are not managing the return of China intelligently and well. United States is still trying to stop the rise of China, even though, as I've argued in my book, as China One, it cannot be done, it will not succeed. And sure, you've seen in all the efforts the United States has made to stop China's technological development have failed, right? And China has become continued to grow and develop. Similarly, the Europeans also have not been able to manage the return of China, and as a result of which, relations within Europe and China are also not very good. And it's an example of lack of Western wisdom in managing the return of a great power.
We'll come to South Asia a little bit later, but Professor Mahbubani, if you could give us a sense of how Southeast Asian nations are looking at rise of China, given there is so much propaganda in the West about Philippines being not even ready to coexist with China. There is a lot of mythology about Vietnam, China now. It would be great if you could give us a better sense of how Southeast Asian nations are, or ASEAN as a bloc, are engaging with China.
Well, I think, as you know, Southeast Asia, we have a regional organization called ASEAN. And ASEAN was established in 1967, 8th August 1967, as a pro-American organization. Now, and sure, clearly, and it has grown and succeeded over the years. So with the rise of China, you should have seen, and by the way, when ASEAN was created, both the Moscow and Beijing condemned the creation of ASEAN. So with the rise of China, you should have seen a lot of discomfort between ASEAN and China. But instead, you've seen a very positive relationship that has developed within the pro-American ASEAN and China. And why is that the case? Because I think the Chinese, one thing about the Chinese that most people don't understand and appreciate enough, is that they're always long-term thinkers. They're always planning for what the world will be like 2 or 3 decades later and how you adjust to it. And I give you a concrete example. This is in the year 2001, right? 24 years ago, right? And China was still not a major economy at that point in time. In fact, the US economy at that time was 8 times bigger than China's economy in 2001. And, what was surprising is that way back then, China became the first country in the world to propose a free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries. Now, that's actually quite shocking because ASEAN's best friends were United States, then Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But none of these countries proposed a free trade agreement to ASEAN. The first country to do so was China. And that was a brilliant preemptive strike by China against any American containment policy. Because as a result of that, I can give you some statistics. In the year 2001, US trade with ASEAN was $135 billion, and which was 3 times bigger than China's trade with ASEAN, which was only $40 billion. So US 135, China was 40 billion in the year 2001. But by 2022, 2 decades later, as a result of the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, even though US trade with ASEAN went up significantly from $135 billion to $500 billion, China's trade with ASEAN went from $40 billion to $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. Now you can see, therefore, that the Chinese thought long-term and say, where do we want to be with our neighbors in ASEAN 20 years down the road? And sure enough, they wanted to see a strong, flourishing trading relationship. And the trading relationship has meant that the ASEAN countries have not joined a containment policy against China. In fact, while they still have very good ties with the United States, they also have very good ties with China. And this is generally the policy of all the ASEAN countries. Of course, there are ups and downs and some specific problems. In the case of the Philippines, for example, Philippines has some issues with China over some shoals and reefs in the South China Sea. But I think in overall, Philippines still tries to follow the ASEAN policy of maintaining some degree of close ties with China.
We might come back to some of these aspects, but if I could bring in South Asia here a little bit, you've been recently writing and talking about India-Pakistan relationship, and something that struck me was your example about Malaysia and Singapore. They separated between these in 1965, but in 1963, Singapore became part of Malaysia. And as you wrote there were ethnic tensions even between Singapore and Malaysia. I mean, that was probably the prime reason of the separations. Mm-hmm. But Singapore and Malaysia have been able to manage their conflict much more amicably, while India and Pakistan have completely failed to do so. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about these two cases and what you think about these two cases. Why is it the case that India and Pakistan have uniquely failed in that? I think that would be of great interest in terms of post-colonial nations being able to manage their differences.
Well, I think the one key word that I think all your listeners should pay attention to is the word pragmatism. To accept realities and not try to change them and work within existing realities. So, for example, Malaysia and Singapore were also united as one country for 2 years from 1963 to 1965. But they had a neurotic relationship after that, because it's like a couple that got married, lived in the house for 2 years, Then they got divorced, but they continued living in the same house. They didn't move away. So in some ways, Malaysia and Singapore, we're neighbors. We can't run away from each other. But we have learned to accept each other, understand each other's differences, respect each other, and move on from the past, and develop a pragmatic relationship of working together. But I think the one relationship that I think India and Pakistan should study the most carefully is the relationship with two countries about the same size as India and Pakistan. India is about the same size as China in population, as 1.4 billion. Pakistan is, of course, in population time bigger than Vietnam, but Vietnam is also around 100 billion. Now, Vietnam and China also have had many centuries, if not millennia, of suspicion of each other, right? In fact, the Vietnamese were occupied by China only for 1,000 years. And, after the big war between Vietnam and China in 1979, right, you would assume that the relations between China and Vietnam would remain hostile, and they should be hostile now. But what's amazing is that if you go to the Sino-Vietnamese border, you no longer see any soldiers, you no longer see mines, you no longer see barbed wire, all gone. Instead, you see flourishing trade between China and Vietnam. And basically, both sides have decided whatever our past was, we cannot change. We cannot change the past, but we can change the future. And we can learn to work together. And that's why in Vietnam, they have a saying that to become the leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up with China, and you must be able to get along with China. If you cannot do both, you cannot become the leader of Vietnam. So I think for India and Pakistan, the interesting question is, how is it in China and Vietnam went from total hostility? I mean, frankly, the war that was fought between China and Vietnam was massive in 79. I think almost 1 million soldiers were involved, And to go from that to a situation today where Vietnam's number one trading partner by far is China. That's amazing, you know? And that's a result of being pragmatic. Both sides want to grow their economy, both sides want to create a better standard of living for its people, and that's how they've ended up finding ways and means of getting along with each other. So you must be always able to overcome history, and that's what we've tried to do here in Southeast Asia.
What would you think is or are the main reasons behind our inability to move on? I'm thinking about obviously political ideology, radical Hindu nationalism in India, and for a very long time in Pakistan, you've seen, at least since Ziaul Haq's time, a hardline Islamic identity. There is the disputed territory of Kashmir, and a lesser sense of developmentalism in the mobilized politics. So politics has often been mobilized in terms along cultural lines in South Asia. But I wonder what your thoughts are about our inability to move on.
Well, I mean, as you know, the story is complex. And, if you look at my memoirs, which are called, by the way, Living the Asian Century, I describe how my family almost became a victim of the Indo-Pakistan split, because my parents were Hindus living in Hyderabad, Sindh, which is now in Pakistan. And when partition took place, my parents had to leave Pakistan. In fact, my mother had a very, very close shave because she was leaving Pakistan in 1947 at the height of all the riots and killings between Indians and Muslims in India and Pakistan. And she was in the last compartment of the train with 40 or 50 other Hindu women and their children with one seat guard with a single shot rifle. And in the middle of the night, in the middle of the desert, the last compartment of the train got decoupled from the rest of the train. And my mother was very lucky that they were not caught by any mob that came to rape and kill the women. That could have happened, you know. But instead, the next day, the train came along and pushed along my mother's compartment into India, and that's how my mother survived the departure from Pakistan, and that's how I was born in Singapore. I may not have been born if my mother had been killed in the India-Pakistan, wars and so on and so forth. So I personally understand how serious the issue is. But at the same time, I also know that pragmatism can find solutions for India and Pakistan. As we all know now, that Prime Minister Vajpayee and General Musharraf actually almost reached an agreement on how to resolve the issues between India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, soon after that, Prime Minister Vajpayee lost his election, and General Musharraf was removed, and a moment to reconcile was lost. But if both sides make a sincere effort to try and find a reconciliation, you can always find a solution where both sides understand what is important for the other side, and try to achieve a kind of a compromise. Because at the end of the day, a continued war never helps two countries, never. It just brings them down and makes them, in one way or another, prevents the economic growth and development. And by the way, I want to emphasize that it doesn't mean you give up your claims, for example. I mean, I give you a concrete example. Even to today, Malaysia and Philippines are both members of ASEAN. They are trading with each other, they have relations with each other. But technically, Philippines still claims the state of Sabah, which belongs to Malaysia. The claim hasn't gone away, but they continue to cooperate and deal with each other, right? So I think there are things, there are ways and means of solving these problems pragmatically. But given the hugely emotionally charged environment today in both India and Pakistan following the recent clashes, I'm realistic enough to know that nothing can be done in the near future. But people who are planning for the future can wait a while and say, when the right moment comes, let's see what's the right compromise formula for the two countries to adopt.
My next question to you is about something you said about Indian inequality recently. And I don't know the full context of it because I haven't heard your original speech or your writing, but it is reported in India across the mainstream press. The Business Today, which I read, it reported that you said inequality in India is not necessarily bad if it is driven by development. And you give the example of what happens to the top 10%. I guess I have some counter questions there, but if you could first lay out what your original thesis was, I think that would be a better beginning.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, I can tell you where my views on inequality come from, because when I went to do my master's thesis in Dalhousie University, Halifax, Nova Scotia, I wrote my master's thesis on a comparison of the concepts of freedom and equality in the writings of Karl Marx and of John Rawls, who was probably America's greatest political philosopher of recent times. And if you read his book, A Theory of Justice, which is a great book, he says that inequality in itself is not the problem in a society. What is really important is that as a society grows and develops, if the top 10% benefits, does it also lead to improvement for the bottom 10%? Or does it mean that the bottom 10% are worse off? So if in the process of the top 10% getting better, the bottom 10% also see an improvement and see their lives improve, then he says, okay, everybody is improving. But as you know, the reality, the sad reality in the United States, especially, and there's a Nobel laureate, Angus Deaton, who's documented this in his book, Deaths of Despair, how even though the wealthy in America are getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, the bottom, in fact, not just 10%, bottom 50% have not seen an improvement in the standard of living. And that's what John Rawls would be critical of. So the question, therefore, in India is, we can certainly see that the top 10% are improving their livelihoods in India. There's no question whatsoever. Question is, are the bottom 10% also benefiting from it? And here, you have to look, the best data to look at is number one, infant mortality. Is infant mortality going down? Because at the end of the day, the first thing that hits the bottom 10% is their lives are precarious. You get higher infant mortality. And then you look at life expectancy. Is life expectancy growing or coming down? If it's growing, it means that livelihoods are improving, especially for the bottom 10%, because it is the bottom 10% that often and have shorter lives than the top 10%. Then you look at data on literacy, how many children are going to school, and if a larger percentage of children are going to school, then the bottom 10% are also benefiting. So there's data you can use to measure as to whether or not the bottom 10% is improving or not improving.
Yeah, I think an important addition that I would like to personally make in that thesis that you just made an exposition about is also the speed of that growth for the bottom 10%, because one can see a very, very marginal, very, small gradient of growth for the 10%. And then you can argue that as long as we are moving towards that, that's okay, because the top 10% are getting more and more, but the bottom 10% is also getting something more, right? And if you take that line, then you can come to that conclusion where you came to. But I think there are two particular problems in the Indian case. It's not just the bottom 10%. I think it's the bottom 50%, which are extremely stagnant. And I think it's important to raise that question here, given so much of optimism is made about the last 30 years about India since 1991 reforms. Yes, there are some indicators where you see better diffusion, like people are definitely consuming more mobile phones. There are greater accessibility of power. More roads have been made. But there are other indicators where the situation is extremely bad. And I think even more than infant mortality, because that can sometimes come because of technological improvement, is the hunger index. And it is absolutely clear that in the hunger index in the case of India and other forms of nutrition, India's story is extremely bad. In fact, Utsa Patnaik has written this paper where she has found that per capita food consumption dramatically went down from 1991 to 2008, after which the government made some sort of redistributive measures of, subsidized grains and so on, where in 2022, I think after COVID, it came back to the level of 1991 in terms of food consumption. And then you can talk about the levels of nutrition. We also see patterns of migration where Indian cities are so overcrowded because patterns of migrations has been largely driven by push factor rather than pull factor, which talks about our stagnant agriculture. And so I think I wanted to raise this discussion because your point was reported in the Indian media as if we don't have to care about the quality of growth. But I would say that in a society like India, which is extremely poor, or in Africa for that matter, we should care more about inequality than less, than if we are much more developed, because in a relatively less developed country, When you don't care about inequality, then the bottom 10% or bottom 50% is extremely more deprived. I wonder what your thoughts are on what I just said.
Well, I mean, the best way to answer your question is, and by the way, I want to emphasize that I clearly do not know the Indian situation as well as you do, so I would defer to you on the statistics. You know them better than I do. But I would say that if you look at the case of the country that has been more successful at eradicating poverty in recent times, there's no question it's China. In 1980, when Deng Xiaoping began his four modernizations program, there were over 800 million people in China living in poverty. And that's a lot of people, by the way, more than in India, I suspect. And yet now there's zero poverty in China. So the next question is, has this been accompanied by rising inequality or diminished inequality? And the answer is that there has been rising inequality in China, which is, by the way, one reason why President Xi Jinping has launched his Common Prosperity Program, because he believes that you shouldn't have that much inequality. You should try and share some of that. In fact, I think one of President Xi Jinping's biggest concerns is about China becoming a plutocracy like the US. And as you know, that's why there's been efforts to curb the power and influence of the billionaires in China. But at the same time, that hasn't stopped the development of China, right? So it is something that is complicated, but you nonetheless have to acknowledge that certainly in the early phases of development, when you're trying to get countries rising, inequality does rise in the beginning. And then at some point in time, hopefully you can remedy that and try and find solutions. But if in the process of rising inequality, people at the bottom are being lifted up, and as I say, the indicators of infant mortality, life expectancy, literacy all improve, then hopefully all these things will lead to a better life for the people.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you on the China side. I mean, I do think that the China-India comparison has to be more nuanced because they are qualitatively different. I mean, part of the reason is China started with an extremely low Gini coefficient because of the Maoist revolution. And secondly, their inequality is slightly different in terms of its pattern because it's primarily more regionally driven. So the hinterland is much poorer, and the coastal is much richer, 2 to 3 times of per capita difference, and so that's one side of it. But the other side is at the very bottom live in a completely different reality. You go to Chinese cities and you go to Indian cities. One is full of slum, full of beggar. That talks a lot about the countryside actually, and China has been able to shrink its population in the rural dramatically, and Indian population in the rural still lives more than 50%. I mean, still lives in the rural. So I think I don't think that idea that in the initial part of development, inequality will necessarily rise is always the best idea. I mean, it has worked for China post 1990s, but it has not worked for Africa and South Asia. And my own sense is that in places of South Asia and Africa where we are, I mean, per capita the capital stock has always been smaller and the labor stock has always been larger. And that's why income for capital has always been higher, because it has a much dominant place because of its scarcity. I think we have to have more skepticism towards this free market-led growth. But I think that brings me to ask you a little bit about the Singapore model, which also has so much similarity with the Chinese model, where strong non-market state institutions institutions have been combined with market institutions, and a domestic economy, which is where you have both these segments, have been so much well integrated within the world economy or under global capitalism. So if you could tell us a little bit about the success of the Singaporean model, I think that would be of great interest for emerging economies.
Yeah, well, I mean, I sometimes make the outrageous claim, it is an outrageous claim, that not since human history began has any society improved the standard of its living of its people as quickly and as comprehensively as Singapore has done so. Amazing. I mean, because I can tell you, when I grew up as a child, I grew up, again, in my memoirs, Living the Asian Century, I describe how as a child I grew up in a very poor family, in a very poor Singapore. So a simple example of this was that I didn't have a flush toilet till I was 13 years old. And when I went to school at the age of 6, I was put on a special feeding program because I was technically undernourished. And we had debt collectors coming to my house because my father would gamble and drink, and so I mean, I experienced, I would say, a traditional third world poverty as a child myself. So I know how debilitating poverty is and how much it damages you. I'm very sensitive to that. But I've also lived through this incredible transformation of Singapore, where when we became independent in 1965, our per capita income was the same as Ghana in Africa, or $500. And now our per capita income is $88,000, higher than United States or United Kingdom. And no other country has achieved this in the way that Singapore has done so. But I want to emphasize that the people who were responsible for Singapore's success were three exceptional geniuses. They were Lee Kuan Yew, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, and S. Rajaratnam. I knew all three of them, and I described them in my memoirs as best as I can. And if you ask them what their ideology was, they would call themselves democratic socialists. And they believed that the purpose of development was to improve the lives of the people. But at the same time, to do so, you have to work with the capitalists. And one reason why Singapore grew so fast is because we attracted as much foreign direct investment as possible from all countries of the world. I mean, whether United States, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, and so on. So India is also, by the way. So, I mean, the net result of all that was that as a result of Singapore's rapid development, I can tell you, by the way, I mean, this is an undeniable fact, that while inequality in Singapore certainly grew, the quality of lives of people improved dramatically. And when I was ambassador to the UN from 84 to 89, the head of the UNICEF was an American citizen called Jim Grant. And Jim Grant said to me, Kishore, don't speak about the economic development of Singapore. The economic development of Singapore is not a miracle. He says, what's a remarkable miracle is how quickly you reduce your infant mortality. I can't remember the data now. He said you went from X to Y in the shortest possible time of any country in human history. And that's why I highlight the case of infant mortality as an indicator of development. So Singapore has done remarkably well. I also, by the way, when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I gave away the secret of Singapore's success. And he said the secret formula is what I call MPH. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. MPH stands for meritocracy, selecting the best people to work in government or in any organization. P stands for pragmatism, to learn from other countries as much as possible. We asked ourselves, why were the Japanese the first Asian countries to reform? Is because the Japanese copied best practices from the whole world. So we did exactly the same as the Japanese did. And then H is the hardest one. H stands for honesty. And we were lucky that the exceptional founding fathers of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, and Rajaratnam, were absolutely honest and didn't take a penny from the state, which is quite unusual, by the way. for many developing countries. In fact, Dr. Goh Keng Swee was so frugal when he traveled overseas as the Minister of Finance of Singapore. When he arrived at hotels in London or New York, he wouldn't send his underwear for laundry overnight. He would wash his underwear himself in the sink of the hotel to ensure that he wasn't wasting money. And as a result of the honesty and frugality of Singapore's leaders who were democratic socialists, Singapore became as successful as it is today.
I think there is a general decline of that honesty element globally. I don't know why, but we also hear about politicians who had some of these idealism in India. If we could quickly in 2 or 3 minutes, because we are running short of time, end this conversation by giving us a conceptual understanding of what is modern Asia, because everyone takes this entity for granted, and I don't think there will be too many people better than you to define this. I personally think it's not a given entity, and in terms of modern Asia, it's even though it has a very old civilizational history, but it's also very new because nation states emerged out of moment of decolonizations, and a lot of these nations are yet to figure out their relationships between each other. And so, when you talk about Asia, how do you think about this huge, enormous entity? I think that would be a good ending.
Well, I mean, as you know, I've been saying consistently that the 19th century was the European century, the 20th century was the American century, the 21st century will be the Asian century. And fortunately for me, a lot of people seem to agree with me because I say this because when I launched my ninth book, an open access book, a free book called The Asian 21st Century, the German publisher target was to get 20,000 downloads, free downloads around the world. Instead of there being 20,000 downloads, there have been 4 million downloads in over 160 countries. Now, I only mentioned that because it shows you that psychologically the world is preparing for the Asian century. And there's no question that the most successful economies in the 21st century will be the Asian economies. You've seen the growth rates, and Europe, for example, has stopped growing, but Asia will continue to grow. But at the same time, when you talk of modern Asia, it's important to emphasize that as the Asian countries develop their economies and develop middle class societies and become reasonably affluent, once you become reasonably affluent, you then have the means to pay attention to other issues like cultural issues. And so, what I predict is that in modern Asia, you will see a massive cultural renaissance of all the great civilizations of Asia. And Asia has got the Asian continent probably has got the richest history of any continent bar none, even richer than that of Europe. And just as the Europeans themselves experienced a cultural renaissance after their economic development, you will find that the Asian nations will experience an equally massive cultural renaissance in the decades to come. So I think if you are a young Asian, this is the best time to be alive in Asia.
Not a lot of times we end with such optimism, given the situation around us generally. Politics in particular is not so hopeful. But Professor Mahbubani, this was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.